The shot opens on Balmoral in August 1979. Charles stands alone in a Scottish river, fly rod in hand, water rushing past his waders. The camera holds on him at a distance that feels wrong. Not the intimate close-up you'd expect for a grieving grandson, a wide shot that emphasizes the empty landscape swallowing him whole. Cut to a separate location. Queen Elizabeth and Princess Anne together, shotguns raised, taking aim at grouse. Mother and daughter operate in sync, a practiced unit. And Charles? He occupies his own frame entirely. This is Season 4, Episode 1. Gold Stick. Lord Mountbatten was killed by an IRA bomb on August 27, 1979. The explosion aboard his fishing boat in Mullaghmore, Ireland, killed Dickie, his 14-year-old grandson Nicholas, his daughter's mother-in-law, and a young boat hand named Paul Maxwell. Prince Charles lost the man he considered his mentor, his confidant, his surrogate father. But here's what most viewers consciously register. Charles is sad. The family is at Balmoral. Tragedy has struck. What they feel but cannot articulate. The camera already told you everything about this family's relationships before anyone spoke a single line of dialogue. Charles, isolated, alone in the frame. Elizabeth and Anne, together, functional, a unit. That's not random blocking. That's the show's cinematographer, Adriano Goldman, doing half the emotional work through deliberate shot composition, and most viewers only consciously notice the acting. You're about to see what casual watchers scrolled past. Goldman is served as the Crown's director of photography since the pilot. He shot the vast majority of episodes across all 6 seasons. His work earned him Emmy Awards for Outstanding Cinematography in 2018 for Season 2, and again in 2021 for Season 4's finale, War. The Television Academy kept giving him statues because he kept doing something most television cinematographers don't even attempt. He calls it visual subtext. In interviews with the Television Academy and American Cinematographer, Goldman has explained his philosophy in terms that transform how you'll watch this show. He and executive producer Stephen Daldry would discuss each scene not in terms of what characters say, but in terms of what the images should make audiences feel. If Elizabeth needs to seem isolated despite being surrounded by people, the camera must accomplish that isolation visually. The dialogue comes second. The frame comes first. Goldman also made a decision that would ripple through 6 seasons and 7 decades of fictional history. Each era of Elizabeth's reign would have its own distinct look, its own palette, its own way of moving the camera. This wasn't aesthetic drift. It was calculated evolution that would mirror the changing world Elizabeth inhabits. And more importantly, her own psychological journey from young princess to seasoned monarch to grieving grandmother. When Goldman discusses his technical approach, he emphasizes what he calls motivated light, using practical sources like windows, table lamps, and overhead fixtures rather than artificial setups. The result is rooms that feel genuinely inhabited. Palaces feel like palaces, cold and shadowed in their corners, rather than television sets designed for even exposure. Now you know who's making these choices. Let's decode exactly how he makes them. 5 tools. That's what Goldman deploys to externalize character psychology. Once you see them, you can't unsee them. And suddenly the Crown becomes a different show entirely. The first tool is negative space, the empty area surrounding a subject within the frame. When Elizabeth sits in a room designed for dozens, positioned alone with vast emptiness flanking her, the camera is telling you something her dialogue may never admit. Production designer Martin Childs, who won multiple Emmys for his work on the series, specifically creates spaces that allow for this visual grammar. He and Goldman collaborate to ensure sets provide opportunities for meaningful composition. Rooms with enough depth to isolate characters, windows positioned to create shafts of light that can separate or unite figures. The second tool is depth of field manipulation. Goldman frequently shoots the crown with shallow depth of field, meaning only a narrow slice of the image remains in focus. This allows him to separate characters who occupy the same physical space into distinct visual planes. Two people can stand 3 feet apart and exist in different worlds, one sharp, one blurred, emotionally unreachable. Third, doorway and threshold framing. When we observe Elizabeth from an adjoining room, peering through a door frame that constrains our view, we become voyeurs to power rather than participants. We're not in the room with her, we're watching from outside. Fourth, window framing and reflections. Characters viewed through windows appear trapped, contained, separated from the world outside the glass. Characters reflected in mirrors create doubled images, fractured identity, self-examination, a woman confronting who she's becoming. Fifth, camera height. Shooting from below grants visual authority. Shooting from above diminishes and renders characters vulnerable. Negative space. Depth of field, doorway framing, window framing, camera height. These 5 tools begin in restrained form in Season 1, 1947. By Season 4, 1979, they've achieved virtuosic sophistication. And by Season 6, covering the late 1990s, they've become something else entirely, a visual grammar of institutional decay. Let's trace that evolution. Season 1 opens in November 1947 with Princess Elizabeth's wedding to Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten at Westminster Abbey. Goldman's visual approach announces itself immediately as distinct from typical period drama. Instead of the warm, saturated tones you'd expect from historical romance, he shoots these early sequences with a palette deliberately evoking post-war British newsreels. Slightly desaturated colors, formal compositions, high contrast between light and shadow. The effect places you inside history rather than observing it from a comfortable distance. Claire Foy's Elizabeth in these early seasons receives what Goldman has described as compositional deference. The camera grants her frame position and lighting that establish authority even when the script emphasizes her youth and inexperience. Watch Hyde Park Corner, Season 1's 2nd episode, depicting King George VI's death in February 1952. Elizabeth stands in a Kenyan lodge, dressed in practical safari clothes, receiving news that transforms her identity forever. The camera doesn't push in for melodramatic close-up. Goldman holds a medium shot, lets Foy's stillness communicate shock. And the lodge's wooden architecture frames her, doorways and windows creating a visual cage around the newly trapped monarch. This is the technique Goldman would refine throughout the series, using architecture to visualize constitutional constraint. Elizabeth doesn't simply receive bad news. She receives it while literally framed by structures that will define her life's boundaries. The doorway behind her leads nowhere she can escape. The windows look out on a world she can no longer freely inhabit. Matt Smith's Philip, standing beside her, occupies the same physical space but different compositional space. He's slightly off-center, slightly obscured, already beginning the visual journey toward peripheral positioning that will define his character across decades. The coronation sequence in Season 1, Episode 5, Smoke and Mirrors, June 2, 1953, offers Goldman's most ambitious early work. Shooting at Winchester Cathedral, standing in for Westminster Abbey, he employed what he described as ceremonial geometry, compositions that emphasize symmetry, center frame positioning, the overwhelming scale of ritual space. Foy's Elizabeth appears almost consumed by the cathedral's vastness, a small figure in an enormous frame. But then, the moment of anointment. The camera drops slightly, looking up at her face as she accepts the weight of the crown. Goldman transforms a woman into a monarch through nothing more than a few degrees of camera angle. Once you've seen it, you can never watch that coronation the same way. The camera bows to her at the exact moment she becomes queen. While young Elizabeth receives compositional deference in seasons 1 and 2, another royal receives conspicuously different treatment, and the contrast devastates. The Duke of Windsor, former King Edward VIII, who abdicated in December 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, appears played by Alex Jennings. The visual approach to the exiled Duke creates an instructive counterpoint to Elizabeth's framing that borders on condemnation. Where Elizabeth is shot in clean, formal compositions with motivated light falling evenly across her face, the Duke consistently appears in partial shadow. The lighting employs techniques associated with film noir, the Hollywood genre that used obscured faces to suggest moral ambiguity, hidden motives, corrupt characters. Season 2's Vergangenheit, German for The Past, aired December 8, 2017, and addressed the Duke's controversial wartime conduct. Throughout this episode, the Duke appears shot through windows, seen in reflection, framed by doorways that constrain and confine. Where Elizabeth's windows suggest connection to the outside world she serves, the Duke's windows suggest surveillance. We watch him as though gathering evidence. The production design surrounding him emphasizes cluttered darkness, heavy furniture crowding the frame, a visual environment of accumulated secrets and buried history. When the episode addresses his 1937 visit to Hitler, the camera renders its verdict through shadow. Portions of the Duke's face remain obscured, something always hidden from view. A man whose full truth cannot be seen. The contrast with young Elizabeth in these same seasons is deliberate, calculated, brutal. In one frame, a woman growing into her role, shot with formal respect that matches her constitutional authority. In the next, a man who rejected that role, shot as though the camera itself distrusts him. Elizabeth's scenes feature bright windows looking outward. The Duke's scenes feature dim interiors looking nowhere. Elizabeth moves through doorways that open into new responsibilities. The Duke's doorways lead only to smaller rooms. Progressive confinement matching progressive disgrace. Goldman doesn't need dialogue to judge this character. The light judges him. The shadows judge him. The frame itself issues a verdict. Once you recognize this pattern, you can never unsee the camera's consistent treatment of the Duke of Windsor. He is a figure always partially obscured by composition. The darkness follows him from season 2 through his final appearances played by Derek Jacobi in later seasons. Same shadow, same visual sentence. Season 3 opens in 1964 with a new cast. Olivia Colman assumes the role of Elizabeth. Tobias Menzies takes over as Philip. Helena Bonham Carter as Margaret. Goldman seizes the transition to deepen his visual approach. The palette shifts subtly warmer, slightly more saturated, reflecting the color photography that would have documented this era. But more significantly, Goldman intensifies his isolation techniques. The compositions become almost brutal in their loneliness. They externalize the accumulated weight of Elizabeth's reign in ways that words cannot. Aberfan, Season 3, Episode 3, October 21, 1966. A colliery spoil tip collapsed onto Pantglas Junior School in the Welsh village. 116 children died, 28 adults. Elizabeth waited 8 days before traveling to Wales, a decision widely criticized at the time and one that reportedly haunted her for decades. Goldman's cinematography in this episode performs crucial emotional labor that Colman's performance alone could not accomplish. In scenes depicting Elizabeth at Buckingham Palace receiving updates about the disaster, Goldman employs extreme spatial isolation. Colman sits alone in cavernous rooms, dwarfed by the production design's imposing scale. The wide shots don't merely establish geography. They visualize the distance between queen and subjects, between comfortable palace life and the mud-choked devastation in Wales. Goldman shoots Colman centered in enormous frames, negative space pressing in from all sides. a woman trapped in architectural grandeur while children lie buried under a coal slag. And then, finally, her face in close-up. The tightness of the framing creates intimacy through contrast. We've been held at remove for so long that proximity feels transgressive, invasive, like we're finally being allowed to see what the crown conceals. The episode's climax, Elizabeth's tearful encounter with the bereaved, uses shallow focus to isolate Coleman's face from even the Welsh villagers surrounding her. We see her grief in sharp clarity, while the victims blur around her edges. The camera renders a woman finally feeling what duty prevented her from feeling, and Goldman grants that feeling exceptional clarity. What Coleman achieves through facial control and vocal precision, Goldman achieves through lens and light. Neither is complete without the other. You cannot watch the Aberfan episode again without seeing how the camera participates in creating meaning. It doesn't record Coleman's performance. It collaborates with it. If Olivia Colman's Elizabeth provides the series its emotional anchor in seasons 3 and 4, Tobias Menzies' Prince Philip provides its restless counterweight. And the cinematography captures their dynamic with almost geometric precision. Season 3, Episode 7. Moondust, July 20th, 1969, Apollo 11. The episode tracks Philip's fascination with the astronauts, his eventual meeting with the returned heroes, and his crushing disappointment at their ordinariness. They turn out to be engineers and technicians, not philosopher-explorers. Throughout the episode, Philip's framing oscillates between two modes, compressed and expansive. In domestic scenes with Elizabeth, Goldman traps Philip in tighter compositions. Furniture, doorways, and his wife's presence box him in visually. The palace becomes a prison rendered through the camera's attention to boundaries and barriers. But when Philip escapes into the world, attending the Apollo welcome ceremonies, meeting the astronauts, the framing opens. He suddenly has room to breathe, space in the frame, visual freedom corresponding to his temporary psychological freedom. Watch particularly for shots where Elizabeth and Philip appear together but compositionally separated. Goldman frequently places objects between them, the corner of a desk, a lamp, a vase of flowers, creating visual barriers that suggest emotional ones. When Philip and Elizabeth argue from opposite sides of a room, the argument isn't just verbal. It's spatial, architectural, visual. The room itself seems to take sides, its geography emphasizing their division. The episode stages a crucial confrontation between Elizabeth and Philip about his discontent, filmed in their private apartments with notably soft lighting. A two-shot keeps both in frame, a visual grammar of marriage, of partnership, even in conflict. But watch how the scene ends. As emotional resolution fails to arrive, the characters separate. The camera follows Elizabeth to a doorway where she pauses, looking back. Goldman frames her against the doorframe, literally on a threshold, suspended between the bedroom and whatever lies beyond. The shot captures her in transit, belonging fully to neither space, visually embodying her emotional state. Another technique involves Philip's eye lines. In conversation coverage, Philip frequently looks slightly off-center, not quite meeting Elizabeth's gaze even when addressing her directly. This subtle misalignment suggests a man not fully present, his attention always partly elsewhere. Elizabeth, by contrast, holds direct eye contact. The eye-line differential tells you something about their respective relationships to each other and to duty. She is fully committed to her role. He perpetually chafes against his. The camera tracks this differential constantly, measuring the space between them, tracking its expansion and contraction as their emotional temperature rises and falls. Once you see the visual grammar of this marriage, you cannot watch their scenes together without measuring the distance Goldman places between them. Some shots, they share the frame. Some shots, they might as well be in different rooms. The space tells the story. Season 4 introduces Diana Spencer, and if the Duke of Windsor taught Goldman how to frame disgrace, Diana taught him something more complicated: how to frame a woman the camera cannot seem to hold. Emma Corrin's Diana enters in 1980, and Goldman immediately deploys a visual vocabulary distinct from anything the series had attempted before. Where Elizabeth occupies the center of frames with compositional authority, Diana exists at the edges. Where Philip pushes against the boundaries that contain him, Diana seems to slip through them, present but unreachable, captured but never contained. The technique is almost ghostly. Goldman shoots Diana through doorways more frequently than any other character, but unlike the Duke's doorways of confinement, Diana's doorways suggest escape routes. She's always in transit, always glimpsed, always partially obscured by the frame that's supposed to hold her. Watch her early scenes at Balmoral, moving through the estate as the family observes her. The camera frequently places her in the background of shots where other characters dominate the foreground, but your eye goes to her anyway. That's not accidental. Goldman positions her where she shouldn't command attention, then lights her so she does anyway. The wedding preparation scenes in Season 4 deploy a claustrophobic technique entirely absent from Elizabeth's coronation 3 decades earlier. Where Foy's Elizabeth was granted compositional reverence during ceremonial moments, Corrin's Diana is visually crushed by them. Mirrors multiply her image, fabric engulfs her. The camera shoots from above, remember that's Goldman's 5th tool, diminishing his subject, as Diana disappears into wedding dress fittings and protocol lessons. Elizabeth's ceremonial framing made her larger. Diana's makes her smaller. But here's the visual contrast you'll never unsee. The Duke of Windsor is shot in shadow because he chose exile. He rejected the institution. His obscured framing reflects moral judgment. Diana is shot through doorways and in transit, because the institution is rejecting her. She didn't choose to be caught between frames. She's being pushed out of them. Same visual grammar, opposite meaning. The Duke's shadows follow him because the camera distrusts him. Diana's doorway framing follows her because the camera cannot protect her. Goldman uses identical tools to tell entirely different stories about what it means to exist outside the family frame. The Thatcher scenes in Season 4 present Goldman with a different problem entirely. How do you visually frame a character who refuses to be diminished? Gillian Anderson's Margaret Thatcher arrives in 1979, and from her first appearance, Goldman shoots her with a visual grammar that sets her apart from every royal. Where Elizabeth's framing grants quiet authority through stillness, Thatcher's framing crackles with aggressive composition. Hard edges, sharp angles, light that doesn't flatter but confronts. The Balmoral weekend scenes, where Thatcher visits the estate and fails every aristocratic test, deploy a visual strategy of consistent awkwardness. Goldman shoots the royals in their element with wide, relaxed compositions. They have space. They breathe. Then he cuts to Thatcher, framed tightly, compressed by the Scottish estate she doesn't understand. Her costumes clash with the production design. Her movement patterns cut against the visual rhythm. Watch particularly for eyeline mismatches. When Thatcher speaks to the royals, Goldman frequently shoots their reactions with eyelines that don't quite connect, the subjects looking past each other, addressing different points in space. The visual effect suggests people who exist in the same room, but not the same world. But something shifts in the Downing Street scenes. On her own territory, Thatcher receives the compositional authority Goldman elsewhere reserves for Elizabeth. Centered framing, strong vertical lines, light that emphasizes rather than exposes. The camera doesn't necessarily like Thatcher. Goldman is too subtle for that. But it respects her dominance in spaces she controls. Goldman doesn't tell you whether Thatcher is heroic or villainous. The camera refuses to editorialize on her politics. But it does tell you where she belongs and where she doesn't. That's visual storytelling, without taking sides. By seasons 5 and 6, covering 1991 through 1997, the visual language shifts again, and this shift tells you everything about institutional decay. Imelda Staunton inherits the role of Elizabeth from Olivia Colman, and Goldman's camera treats her differently than either predecessor. The negative space that once isolated Elizabeth now threatens to swallow her entirely. Watch the Windsor Castle fire sequence in Season 5's Annus Horribilis, November 20th, 1992. The actual fire destroyed over 100 rooms at Windsor Castle, including St. George's Hall and the state apartments. Goldman photographs the aftermath with a visual vocabulary of institutional collapse that the earlier seasons never attempted. Smoke-damaged walls fill the frame. Charred beams create new doorways leading nowhere. Threshold framing without thresholds. The geometric confidence of ceremonial composition has shattered. And Staunton's Elizabeth? She stands amid the wreckage with a visual grammar of diminishment. The camera height drops, looking slightly down at her now. Remember, Goldman uses camera height as psychological commentary. In Season 1, the camera rose to meet Elizabeth at her coronation. In Season 5, it sinks as her world burns. The production design no longer creates spaces that grant compositional authority. It creates spaces that mock it. Grand rooms reduced to ash. Formal symmetry destroyed by structural damage. This isn't just metaphor. Goldman discussed with the Television Academy how the later seasons deliberately employed what he called the aesthetics of entropy. The Crown's visual language had to mature alongside its subject, and by the 1990s, that subject was an institution visibly struggling. The divorce proceedings between Charles and Diana receive a visual treatment that extends Goldman's earlier work to devastating effect. In Season 4, Diana slipped through frames. By Season 5, she's being expelled from them entirely. The separation scenes position Elizabeth Debicki's Diana and Dominic West's Charles in compositions where they can barely share visual real estate. When they do appear together, Goldman shoots them with maximum focal separation, one sharp, one blurred, existing in frames that refuse to cohere. But here's the visual evolution that cuts deepest. Elizabeth's relationship with Philip, as Jonathan Pryce assumes the role for Seasons 5 and 6, receives the gentlest framing Goldman ever grants. After decades of measuring the space between them, the camera finally lets them share the frame without visual barriers. Furniture doesn't separate them. Doorways don't divide them. In their private apartments, Goldman shoots Elizabeth and Philip with a two-shot intimacy that feels earned precisely because the earlier seasons denied it. The eyeline differential disappears. After 40 years of Philip looking slightly away, he finally meets her gaze. And Goldman holds that shot, holds it longer than dramatic pacing requires, because the visual grammar has been teaching you to notice when characters connect. This moment means something, because all those earlier moments of disconnection taught you to recognize its absence. You can't feel the warmth of those late-rain Elizabeth Philip scenes without having internalized the coolness of their earlier compositions. Goldman counted on 6 seasons of visual education. The technical evolution of The Crown deserves its own examination, because Goldman didn't just develop a visual philosophy, he adapted it across radical changes in camera technology. Seasons 1 and 2 were shot on the Sony f/55, a camera Goldman chose for its ability to handle the high contrast ratios his lighting style demanded. The practical lighting approach, all those windows and table lamps serving as primary sources, create significant exposure differences between light and dark areas of the frame. The f/55 sensor handled that range without crushing shadows or blowing highlights, preserving the detail Goldman needed in both palace window light and corner shadow. But between Seasons 4 and 5, Goldman transitioned to the Sony Venice, and that change wasn't merely technical. The Venice offered larger photo sites, better color science, and, crucially, the ability to shoot with anamorphic lenses that Goldman increasingly favored. What does anamorphic do? It creates a wider aspect ratio and distinctive optical characteristics, oval bokeh in out-of-focus areas, subtle horizontal flares, a different relationship between foreground and background. Watch Season 6 closely. The out-of-focus elements look different than in Season 1. Softer, more cinematic. The background blur has a quality that flatters faces while isolating them from their environment. Goldman discussed how this lens choice supported the later season's themes. As the timeline approached living memory, Diana's death in August 1997 occurred just 26 years before Season 6's release. He wanted a visual texture that felt less like documentary recreation and more like subjective memory. The anamorphic characteristics create images that feel slightly dreamed, slightly impressionistic, appropriate for depicting events audiences might actually remember. The color grading evolution tracks this same arc. Between Seasons 3 and 4, Netflix invited Goldman to regrade all episodes of Seasons 1 and 2 in HDR, high dynamic range, ensuring the visual evolution would remain coherent even as display technology changed. This wasn't a simple conversion. Goldman personally supervised the new grades, adjusting the early season's palette to coexist with the later season's expanded color gamut. The result? Viewers watching on HDR displays experience a unified visual language across all 6 seasons. The newsreel formality of 1947 flowing naturally into the warmer tones of 1964 through the increasingly complex palettes of the 1980s and 1990s. Goldman didn't want technological inconsistency to interrupt the visual storytelling. That's the level of attention operating here. Not just shooting beautifully, but preserving the integrity of a visual grammar across cameras, lenses, display formats, and years. Which brings us back to Balmoral, August 1979. Gold stick. Now you have the vocabulary. Charles fishing alone in wide shot. That's negative space telling you about isolation. Elizabeth and Anne together, sharing a frame. That's compositional unity telling you about connection. The camera's distance from Charles. That's Goldman denying intimacy, forcing emotional remove. The Mountbatten assassination devastated Charles. But Goldman doesn't show you that through close-ups of tears. He shows you that through spatial isolation, through compositional exclusion, through a frame that places the future king alone while his mother and sister operate as a functional unit in an entirely separate visual space. The series had spent 3 seasons developing this vocabulary. By Season 4, Goldman trusts that you'll feel it, even if you can't articulate why. The camera has been teaching you its language episode by episode. This moment is the exam, and most viewers pass it. They feel something profound in this Balmoral sequence. They just couldn't tell you why until now. The dialogue delivers information. The performances deliver emotion. But the camera? The camera delivers meaning. And here's the thing you can never unsee. Every frame of The Crown is a deliberate choice. Every placement of a character within the rectangle of the screen reflects someone's decision about what that moment means. Negative space isn't accidental. Shadow isn't lazy lighting. Doorways and windows and mirrors aren't random production design. They're vocabulary. Elizabeth, isolated by negative space in a palace too large for human warmth. Philip, compressed by architecture in a life too constrained for his restlessness. Charles, alone in a river while his mother and sister share their frame. The Duke of Windsor, shadowed by a camera that judges him before anyone speaks. Diana, slipping through doorways the frame cannot contain. Thatcher, commanding some spaces, expelled from others. And by the 1990s, an institution itself framed as damaged, burning, struggling to hold its compositional center. Each character receives a visual grammar matched to their relationship with the institution. The camera knows who belongs. It knows who's leaving. It knows who never fit. And in the final seasons, it knows the institution itself is wounded. You felt all of this. Every viewer feels it. Goldman counted on that. But now you know why you felt it. Now you have words for what the camera was doing while you thought you were just watching the actors. Now you see the second layer of storytelling that runs beneath every scene. The silent work being done in composition, in light, in the simple placement of a figure within a frame. The Crown won Emmy after Emmy for cinematography because Goldman wasn't just pointing a camera at talented performers in expensive costumes. He was writing a parallel script in images, one that most viewers absorbed unconsciously. You're not most viewers anymore. Next time you watch any prestige drama, not just The Crown, ask yourself, where is this character placed in the frame? What objects separate them from other characters? How much negative space surrounds them? Are they shot through doorways, through windows, in reflection? What's the camera height doing to their authority? The camera is always telling you something. Now you know how to listen. Subscribe for more stories like this.